8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire by Simplified Emotions. Rule number 3. Vampires are known to be affectionate, so what is Draco playing at? It turned out that working for 4 years at the Ministry only granted Hermione a modicum of persuasion, and even then it was Harry throwing his weight around that got her into a meeting with the senior members of the Wizengamot. She hated asking for things, and even though he was her best friend, she felt horribly guilty asking Harry for his support when he was drowning under his own duties as one of the newly appointed senior Aurors. But after some playful grumbling, he'd agreed to help her. Harry had gotten used to public speaking after being promoted, being tasked with more assignments that made him the lead on several cases, resulting in him dealing with members of the public and the press, making him the perfect guinea pig for Hermione to practice her cue cards on. He didn't question Hermione's sudden fervency for vampire rights, only teased that her list of creature rights was growing longer and longer. At Hermione's correction that vampires were not technically creatures, Harry rolled his eyes and opened the doors to their meeting with the senior members of the Wizengamot. The meeting was scheduled a few doors down from the court, with a long table which 3 of the most senior members sat behind: Simon Ackley, Charlotte Campbell, and Alpheus Dodge. Chief Warlock William Everly, a man in his late 50s, was present as well. Hermione told Harry that Dodge was a key person to the promotion of Hermione's legislation because he had been a close friend of Dumbledore's as well as a member of the Order of the Phoenix. She hoped that fondness for his old friend would extend to Harry himself. By the fond twinkle in the old man's eyes and the soft smile he sent Harry's way, who smiled awkwardly as he straightened his chair, Hermione felt confident in gaining his support. Campbell, the only female present, much to Hermione's chagrin, was much more personable according to her research, and would at least hear out any legislation brought to her. Campbell was stern and would undoubtedly challenge Hermione's points, but having looked at previous cases, including the Malfoy trial post-war when Charlotte had voted in favor of Draco receiving only a year in Azkaban, Hermione was confident that if she approached Charlotte with logic and tenacity, it would work in her favor. That left Simon Ackley, a handsome pureblood wizard who was one of the youngest members of the Wizengamot. He had black hair and icy blue eyes, as bright as Draco's, Hermione thought, but they were much colder than his were. Ackley had always been the biggest thorn in Hermione's side when it came to any legislation her department drew up. He found issues in every single aspect of her work, causing Hermione several nights of unnecessary revision, even by her standards. She had suspected that Ackley was averse to creatures' rights specifically, because Dean Thomas, who worked in the legal department at the DMLE, had told Hermione that they never experienced many issues representing different wizarding clients and bringing their cases to review with him. Dean had even said several times that Ackley was kind. Such kindness was not extended to her department and by extension herself, especially if the way Ackley was looking across the table at Hermione was any indication. He looked at her with such a level of disdain that would make most people shrivel. Unfortunately for him, Hermione wasn't most people. She lifted her chin and dared him to ignore her. Meeting her determined stare, Ackley spoke up, giving her a thin smile. "Oh, Potter, and Miss Hermione Granger." His voice was venomous when he said her name. "Before we begin, I must ask why Mr. Potter is in a meeting when he does not work in the legal department. I hope you are not using Mr. Potter's fame as a way to get into meetings now, Miss Granger," he said, sickly sweet as he levelled with her with a smug smirk. "Harry Potter is here as a character witness for his interactions with other vampires," Hermione said confidently. "He has been on several, 3 to be exact, but Hermione was the only one who ever paid attention to the details, missions, and has interacted with multiple vampire covens. He is here to give weight to my research," she said. "And just how are those demons supposed to be trusted with a wand that will make them undoubtedly stronger than a normal witcher wizard. First of all, Hermione said pointedly, already feeling frustration seep through her composure, vampires and demons are of entirely different classifications. Of the existing reasons why they are completely different from each other, the most important distinction is that demons are summoned, while vampires are bitten but still retain human-level consciousness. Come on now, Miss Granger. Surely that doesn't matter when they are. Vampires are not feral beasts, Mr. Eckley, Hermione said, interrupting him. Although I will point out that no creature or other non-human should be treated as though they are unconscionable monsters. The important point I'm trying to make today is that there is no reasonable reason for vampires not to have access to a wand, simply because of their status as non-wizards. Let me show you an example of them being reasonable, Miss Granger, said Eckley coldly, his eyes narrow slits as he stared her down. He waved his hand swiftly, and the grey apparition of a foreign newspaper appeared, the headline reading in bold capital letters. Attack on Muggle village in Bulgaria. All supporters of Voldemort responsible for attack. Wizards in dark robes and masks, and a few unmasked vampires spotted, their mouths dripping with what was undeniably their victim's blood. Hermione clenched her teeth to stop her magic lashing out in anger. That is an attack by a dark faction of Voldemort supporters who also happen to include vampires. These two things are not bound together. She sat up straighter, levelling Eckley with the darkest look she could muster, a fury building inside her. Also, I see you fail to mention that the attack included dark wizards as well. The attack would not have been as destructive if the demons did not have wands, he said, face rapidly reddening in anger. Demons and vampires are not... It does not matter what you classify them as, It does, actually, she snarled lowly. They are... Someone cleared their throat. Hermione and Eckley turned their heads to Evely, who was giving Eckley a stern look behind his round spectacles. He reminded Hermione a bit of McGonagall when a younger student would step even a toe out of line. Member Eckley, we have agreed to hear Miss Granger's case. There's no reason to start criticizing her before she's even begun. Eckley nodded reluctantly, withering somewhat under the old man's gaze, and turned his eyes back on Hermione, his expression dark. She bristled, but met his cruel gaze. His eyes were bottomless, the icy blue crystallizing in determination as he motioned for her to start. The first meeting went rather well by Harry's standards, which meant that it actually went horribly, but Hermione didn't have the heart to tell him. Dean joined him for lunch during the intermission, where Harry tried to assure her things were going rather well. He didn't have the heart to tell him how wrong he was, and whilst he and Dean discussed something she wasn't really listening to, Hermione thought about the positives and negatives of the meeting. While Eckley was slightly less hostile after his admonishment, he still scoffed any time Hermione would get to her main points of why vampires deserved access to wands. She was happy to see that the other three senior members looked more interested in their arguments, and was at least confident that they could be convinced to really listen and consider her case, but Eckley looked like he would rather burn down the entire ministry than allow Hermione even a slither of hope. She didn't understand what drove his hatred. It wasn't merely creatures he seemed to hate, Hermione more than anything. His eyes specifically were daunting to her. They were so full of vitriol and resentment, the same way Draco's eyes bore into her when they were at Hogwarts. Thoughts of Draco brightened her mood. She was going to visit him today, excited to be able to relax a little longer at the manor because it was Friday night. She reluctantly admitted to herself that visiting with Draco was fast becoming her favorite part of the week. The delicate accord they had built since they started making potions together had meant that the last few months had almost no fighting between the two of them. Except, of course, when he was wrong, which was often. She was only doing the right thing by correcting his sometimes flawed opinions. After a few more hours of dreaded work and making sure she could keep her night free, Hermione all but collapsed into the chair near the fire as she entered the manor library. "Malfoy!" she called. There was no reply. She turned and saw that there was no one there. That was odd. Draco was always in the library, or if he was going to be working in his potions lab, he would still greet her and they would walk there together. There was a heavy sound at the door and Hermione jumped. She got up and drew her wand, moving towards the door carefully. The door handle rattled again and the door opened abruptly when she was a few feet away. She gasped when she saw Draco kneeling on one knee, a stricken expression on his face as he panted for breath. He seemed to realize she was standing there because he forced himself to stand shakily and grimaced. "Granger?" He nodded. The slight movement seemed to almost take what little energy he had out of him. "What's wrong with you?" "You look tired," he feigned. "You look worse," she replied, tone flat. "You wound me." He looked like he was trying to smirk, but he seemed to lose air for a moment and his body swayed. Hermione went up to him, ignoring his swatting hands away as she put her own to his arm in an effort to steady him. "Tell me what's wrong," she said, brows furrowing in worry. He was caught with a touch. He tried moving away. "Draco," she said more forcefully. He sighed. "Those blood packets are an affront to anything that could be considered edible. Every time I drink from them, all I'm left with is an acrid taste in my mouth that lasts all day. I imagine it's the equivalent of eating only cauliflower at every meal." Hermione gasped. "So you—" "I don't take them regularly, only when I absolutely need them." She slapped his shoulder. "Fuck, Granger!" He rubbed his shoulder. "Did I not just say that I don't feel well?" "You foolish man with your stupid, delicate sensibilities. They're not supposed to taste good, they're supposed to keep you alive." He sneered at her and tried to pull away, but she kept a hold on him. "You try having blood as your only form of sustenance, and then you can lecture me about my delicate sensibilities," he sniped. She sighed, biting her lip. "Please don't do that." She furrowed her brows. "Why?" His breath was becoming ragged. "Just don't," he pleaded. Hermione blushed but nodded. She modestly summoned a blood packet and whizzed it through the open door and into her hand. "Drink," she commanded. He looked at the packet as if it were the most offensive thing he'd ever seen. The irony was not lost on Hermione that she was no longer the focus of that particular expression of his. When he looked like he was ready to bolt away from the door, Hermione stepped into his personal space, crowding him. "You are unbelievably frightening for someone so tiny. And you are unbelievably condescending even when you're anemic." He gave her a cold smile before tearing open the packet and with a grimace downed the contents. He made a retching sound but pressed a hand to his mouth and gulped. There was a faint trace of blood on his mouth, and before thinking about it, Hermione reached up and brushed it away. He flinched. "Don't touch it," he said. "It's just blood. I saw my fair share of it during the war." After wiping it from his mouth, she cast a cleaning charm on both of them and palmed his cheek. "You're freezing." He smirked. "Yes, it's my natural inclination, you see." "Shut up! More than usual." "Do you touch me often, Granger? To know something like that?" She narrowed her eyes. "I touch you enough." She grabbed his wrist and led him out of the library in the opposite direction of his potion lab. He stopped, halting her. "Where are we going?" "To your room," she said. "My room isn't this way." Hermione stopped and turned, still holding onto his wrist. "Oh, I assumed that was where you went when I left." He gave her a sad smile. "My mother's portrait is down the hall. I talk to her sometimes, let her know what's going on. Mostly nothing, but she says a good son always visits his mother." "Oh." "I'd bring you to meet her, but I'm afraid that even a portrait remembers its bigotry." Hermione shifted, looking away. "I imagine so." "We could try." He looked up at him again. I don't want to be intrusive. Some of the colour was returning to his cheeks as he gave her a smile that made her breath catch. When has that stopped you before, Hermione? No. What was a catch in her breath turned into suffocation. Her throat closed up because the neurons in her brain were too busy firing off the unexpected stimulus she felt in her nerves as he said her first name. Not with mocking contempt or disgust, but fondness. He was teasing her, and she felt her cheeks and neck, and really, if she was being honest, her entire body heat at the way he was looking at her just then. "What happened to your mother?" she asked, hoping her voice sounded calmer than the jumped-up schoolgirl she felt she was acting like. "She was always sickly when I was younger, even more so during the war because of the Dark Lord. After the war, with my father gone and then dying thanks to the conditions in Azkaban, I think she just gave up." His eyes had a faraway look in that moment, a peer into the past that only the cracks in his gaze made her privy to. How much pain was he holding in? "Draco, I'm—" He shook his head, eyes clearing. "A conversation for another day, I think. I doubt I could muster a conversation about hot cocoa tonight." She gave him a small smile, despite a tightening in her chest, and resisted the urge to rub it. But for the first time since she'd been visiting him, she felt like he would talk to her if he needed to. That was enough for her. Besides, he still looked like he was ready to keel over from exhaustion. "Another night, then," she agreed. "Now, take me to your room." He almost grinned at her. It was boyish, and she realized somewhat crooked now that he had 2 pointy canines. "Rather presumptuous of you, Granger," he said. "You haven't taken me to dinner." She arched a brow. "We already get on so bloody well, so why not?" Draco choked on a laugh and then let out a shaky breath before composing himself. He took Hermione's hand in his much larger and warmer one, and Hermione felt a fluttering again in her stomach and chest as he led her down the corridor to the left, climbing the stairs to the hall with several rooms. They had to stop halfway up as Draco heaved, obviously feeling the side effects of the blood packets. He obstinately refused to have Hermione help him walk, but after reaching the top and looking as if his legs were going to give out on him, he begrudgingly let her hold on to his elbow until they reached what Hermione assumed was his room. "Draco, it's freezing," Hermione said as they entered the large room. There was a large 4-poster bed that was white and grey, although she noticed dark green pillows and a sparse amount of furniture, all dark. Pulled out her wand and lit the fireplace. Taking hold of his hand again, Hermione led Draco to the bed and pushed his chest until he sat down. "Take off your shoes." He raised a brow at her, but removed his shoes and socks compliantly. He peeled back the covers and looked longingly at the soft duvet and silk sheets. "All right, rest time." He looked like he was going to protest, and she stopped him. "I don't want to hear a word about it. You need to rest." Giving her only a slightly petulant look, he sighed and got into bed. "If the lady insists," he said. Hermione rolled her eyes and went to go settle the covers around him because clearly he did not do it properly enough to cover himself. What she did not expect was for him to grab her wrist and haul her into bed with him. "What, Malfoy?" She squirmed to get out the bed, but he reached an arm around her waist and dragged her back. "If you are forcing me to sleep in the middle of the day, then I'm taking your Ibex hose tag as well," he argued. She gaped at him. "I am not sleeping in the same bed as you." "I won't bite." "Aha, you are so funny," she said sarcastically, but she stopped trying to get out of bed. At some point he had draped a blanket over her, and his hand was resting beside her hip as he sat up. "Just sleep, Granger. I'm not going to do anything to you." She looked up at him. "I know you, I trust you," she said. His eyes widened, and he looked like he was trying to look for something to say, but couldn't. "I'm not sleeping in my shoes or blazer, though." She sat up and took off her flats and unbuttoned her blazer. She was left in a soft white blouse her mom had gotten her for last Christmas, and her work skirt and tights. When she lay back down, she felt more awkward than before, considering the stillness of his body next to her. Malfoy must have felt the same. He also did not have enough of the blanket over him. Sighing, she reached around and pulled the duvet over him again, looking down at him as she did so. She was half draped over his body and blushed profusely at the realization. After setting it over him, she lay back down on her side, and Draco turned to her. Her eyes widened when he reached for her and pulled her against his chest. She gasped. "What are you?" He wrapped his arms fully around her. "You're warm," was all he said in reply, burying his face in her neck. She blushed and had the strangest urge to whimper. "That doesn't mean Draco." "Just sleep, Granger. I'm sick and cold and you're tired and warm. It's rather a good combination for sleep, I would say." He adjusted his body more comfortably around her. At the same time, Hermione tried to wriggle away. She swallowed when he turned and pinned her beneath him, and she flushed, squirming as he pressed against her. His body seemed to be rapidly heating up, but he seemed content where he was. "Fine," she snapped, feeling her cheeks heat as he scrutinized her. "Just let me get the blankets around us. Get off me!" "Only teasing, Granger," he said in a throaty voice, moving off of her, laying on his back once more. Hermione shivered when the weight of his body left her. She didn't allow herself to think it was an absence. She settled the blankets around them and laid back down, her back to Draco. Though she knew this was a pointless endeavor, because not even a few seconds later Draco wrapped a strong arm around her waist, gently dragging her to him. She huffed, but acquiesced by turning around in his arms so she could press herself closer to him, and then took an indulgent sniff of his chest. The smell of sandalwood, jasmine, and a scent that was entirely Draco, lulling her to sleep. Draco seemed to promptly fall asleep, his breathing even out as he puffed warm air on her hair. Every inch of his body was pressed against hers, and she inwardly smiled when he tangled his feet with hers. She eventually fell asleep, breathing him in, wondering about the affection of vampires. Wondering about the affection of Draco Malfoy. Hermione woke around what seemed like hours later, if the starry sky outside was any indication, but Draco was still sleeping soundly beside, dead to the world. She briefly wondered how long she could accidentally keep making jokes about the undead and Draco before she bought herself a one-way ticket to hell. She looked up at him, but couldn't see much of his face, as it was currently smushed in her curls. He was breathing deeply, and his warm breath was near her ear, causing shivers to roll down her spine. "Draco," she whispered. He stirred, but did not reply. "Draco," she said a little louder, a sigh. "What is it, Granger?" he asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. She flushed at the heaviness in his voice. "Aren't you suffocating in there?" "It's more like a fluffy cloud," he muffled, nuzzling her even more and causing her hands to clench in his shirt. Completely unwillingly, of course. She snorted. "I have to go." He looked up towards the window. "It's night time. Go back to sleep." She raised a brow. "You want me to stay the night?" He didn't reply, his breathing already becoming even once more as he curled against her. She blushed before burrowing against him, relishing in the feel of his strong arms pressing her to him with the softest touch. Hermione had almost succeeded in escaping Ginny and Harry's Christmas Eve get-together inconspicuously when she stepped on a squeaky quaffle toy. Bugger! She was the one who had got James that toy too. It was decidedly rude of him to leave it lying around like that, hindering her escape. Turn around to see an amused Ginny, arms crossed as she gave Hermione an assessing stare. "You know, Hermione, you could have just invited whoever is tonight." Hermione looked at her for a moment before realizing what she meant. No, that is absolutely not what is going on," Hermione said. Ginny gave her a knowing smirk. "So, where are you off to so early in the evening? You haven't even said goodbye." Hermione paused. "To see a—" She pondered for a moment. "A friend. He's a friend. Ginny wiggled her eyebrows teasingly. A friend? Ginny, Hermione said, exacerbated. Ginny smirked. Fine, keep your secrets, but sooner or later you'll have to introduce your mystery man to us. Mystery man. Hermione inwardly laughed. And in room C there was Draco Malfoy, former Death Eater, part of the sordid House of Malfoy, has despised her and her kind for centuries, and, oh, did I mention he is also a blood-sucking vampire who spends his days reading Muggle philosophers such as Faust and Kierkegaard? Hermione smiled. There's nothing to tell, Ginny, I promise. Yes, yes. On your way. Don't have too much fun. She winked as she said it. Hermione rolled her eyes, stepping into the fireplace and calling out her destination. Before the green flames whisked her away, she distantly heard Harry comment about how much more awake she seemed lately. Hermione groaned at the smile she imagined had spread across Ginny's annoyingly freckled face. Draco? Hermione called as she stepped through the flue, spelling the suit of her robes. Recently he'd given her access to the Floo network so it would make it easier for her to come to the manor. She returned to her flat to pick up her gift for him before fluing over, but she cursed herself for forgetting the wine in her nervousness. Draco poked his head out from a nearby bookshelf. Ranger? He gave her a bemused look. What are you doing here? Happy Christmas, she said, holding up a red bag with a green bow in it. He looked at her for a moment. Don't you have plans? Why are you here? He asked. His tone sounded frustrated. Hermione's face fell. I did. Or I was at them. I left early to come here so I could give you your present. He didn't say anything. She fidgeted, feeling less brave than when she arrived. I also intended to bring wine, but I've forgotten it. I can go back and... No need, he interrupted. Ranger, I really don't need you to pity me, he said. Hermione rolled her eyes. So that's what he was thinking? The only pitiable thing about you was when you grovelled for Wimley to make your soup last week like when you were 10 years old. He laughed. Oh, I'm glad I still have the ability to blush. She gave him a tentative smile, feeling vulnerable in a way she never had before. It felt like she was on the edge of a precipice. I'm going to be right back with the wine, then. He waved his hand dismissively. I have wine. There's really no need. All she had to do was tip forward. She turned back, unable to hold the grin she sent his way. Good. And she would fall. He emerged more fully in the light, a small smile dancing on his face. Good. The question was, what awaited her at the bottom of that icy cliff? Later, after what Hermione would deem too many glasses of wine and Draco not enough, he declared it had to do with vampires' better control of their blood alcohol level, to which Hermione snorted so loudly she felt like her nose broke in the process. They sat on the couch, talking about all sorts of topics, although one in particular was not to Hermione's liking. I do not always blush. You do, don't lie. You're especially red now that you've had some wine in you. Yes, well, not all of us have vampire blood, she said, scowling when Draco smirked at her. He stood, intending to get more wine with a weak protest from Hermione, but first he leaned towards her, slowly tucking a curl behind her ear, his thumb ever so lightly brushing the arch of her cheekbone as he gathered one of the more annoying spirals back from her face. His hand goes at the side of her neck, causing a tingle to rise up, and Hermione tried to repress the shiver that was crawling its way up at the barely there contact. It was the refrain of a scent, the almost touch, that felt more intimate than anything. She felt a sort of yearning as she looked up at him. His eyes weren't meeting hers, however. They were solely fixed on her mouth, where she was subconsciously biting her lip. She felt shy all suddenly, pressing her lips together. His eyes flicked up to meet her own, the moment breaking as he looked away quickly and cleared his throat. I'll be right back. Hermione adjusted herself while he was gone, grateful for the air that had graciously made its appearance once again. Hermione was sitting cross-legged on the couch when he returned several minutes later. He dropped down onto the seat beside her, balancing 2 wine glasses and a new bottle as Hermione fidgeted nervously. I got you something," she said. You already said that, Granger," he said, taking a healthy swig of his wine while Hermione put hers on the side table so she could pass him his gift. "Yes," she replied, biting her lip. "Except you're not allowed to judge it until you use it, all right?" Draco lifted a dark brow but nodded as he put his wine down and took the gift bag from her. He placed it on his lap, removing the packaging from the bag. He peered at it for a moment as if unsure of what to do, and then started to delicately unwrap the ruby-red paper as if he were afraid of ripping it in the wrong place. "You don't have to be so gentle," she teased, laughing lightly as he glared at her. Draco finished unwrapping it after what felt like hours, carefully placing the wrapping back in the bag, and opened the small box which held his present. His mouth was set in a thin line as he inspected the small device. "It's an MP3, she said, moving closer to Draco when he said nothing. "I saw muggles use these at university," he said. "I haven't used them all, though," he cut off. It was Hermione's turn to raise a brow, and she drew even closer to Draco, knees touching. He stiffened for a moment before relaxing and resting his thigh against Hermione's. "Tell me," she said. "So bossy," he said, a small smile on his face as he turned more towards her. "I've never used an MP3, but you know those square devices with the large earmuffs they have in the library so you can listen to the tape?" "Earmuffs?" "Yeah, those." He fisted his hands in 2 fists on top of his head. "You place them on top of your head, click play, and then the sound comes out of them." Hermione burst out laughing, grasping Draco's knees so she wouldn't fall off the couch. "Those are called headphones," she corrected, small giggles still escaping her. He scowled but considered for a moment. "Well, whatever they're called, they are scratchy and uncomfortable. Anyway," he said, placing one of his hands on the back of his neck to rub it awkwardly, "you should have seen the look on the librarian's face the first time I tried to use them. I had no clue how to turn those things on, and I possibly sniffed the material of the headphones," he corrected, earning another grin from Hermione. "She had to explain to me in embarrassing detail how to work them. I rather thought I was at Hogwarts again, and Pins was showing me the proper way to read a book." Hermione snorted. "I imagine it was a sight to behold, you fumbling with a muggle device," she teased. He rolled his eyes. "So, how do I work this new contraption? I'm glad to see the headphones are small on this one," he said, holding out the long cord attached to the black MP3. "Oh, so these are actually called ear—" She stopped herself at his glare. "So, the MP3 doesn't need to be charged. I've put a magical charm on it so it always stays full of battery," she explained. At his surprised expression, she rolled her eyes. "You weren't the only one good at charms, Draco." And she flushed at how easily his first name rolled off her tongue. Draco was blushing as well. "How did you know I was good at charms?" he asked. "Well, the Potter Stinks badges were very rude. They were a rather impressive use of charm work for someone who was only 14, Hermione stated primly. He snorted. "Your compliments mean the world to me, Granger. Now, tell me how this thing works." She smiled, reaching to where he was still holding the device. She showed him the on and off button and the different functions that would allow him to skip a song, go back and play again. "I've put a few different genres because I wasn't sure what you liked, including a recording of a German play called Elizabeth. If you wanted, you could play it while you brew." "I will." He smiled, and her breath hitched. "I've heard of that play. Have you seen it?" "I hope to one day," she said. "My parents saw it when they visited Vienna, but I haven't had the time yet. From what my mum told me, it's a compelling story of a woman who was in love with death, and the tragic circumstances that occurred because she was mortal." He nodded. "Loving someone whose life is finite in yours is never ending." He furrowed his brows, a faraway look flitting across his face momentarily. "It would never work," he said finally, his expression inscrutable. Hermione shrugged. "You never know." He looked at her for a long moment, that faraway look and something else painting his pale features. "I got your present too," he said after several seconds. Hermione's eyes widened. "You did?" He nodded. "I was going to give it to you next week, but I have it now. Give me one moment." He returned just as Hermione downed a glass of wine, her nerves demanding to be dulled. She was refilling her glass just as he sat down. It was taller, with red packaging as well, although the red was a deeper shade. Blood red, her brain supplied. She had trouble gulping for a moment. She accepted it with a nervous smile, feeling her heart thud almost painfully in her chest. Hermione unwrapped the delicate packaging with shaking hands and gasped at what was revealed when the paper fell away. The first edition collection of the Lord of the Rings trilogy was stacked together. A bookmark of a ginger cat looking far too much like Crooks rested on the top. The 3 white hardcover laminated books looked old, faint tears on the spine and the front of the book, and she could see that the pages looked old when she opened the 2 towers, but all in all, they were in great shape. "Draco," Hermione said, delicately caressing the spine of the books with reverence. "Where did you find the original set?" "You were talking about how you couldn't find this version a couple of weeks after you first started coming to the manor." Hermione looked up, surprised. "You remember that?" "Of course I do, Granger. Some of us actually use our brains," he retorted. She ignored his tone. "Where did you find it?" "I frequented a small bookshop while in Germany, and the old Muggle shopkeeper had several old editions of books. I wrote to him on a whim that he might have this collection, and after figuring out the Muggle postal service, had it mailed to the office at Malfoy Investments." Hermione's face broke out into a big, bright smile. This is," she settled on. "Thank you." He looked suddenly uncomfortable, looking anywhere but at her. "Yes, well, now you can read them." "As I recall, you haven't read any Tolkien. I think I must make you somehow now." He huffed. "Why would I want to read about magic when I already live in a magical world?" he asked petulantly. "There are all sorts of magic in this world. This trilogy just happens to be one of the most famous." "Whatever you say, Granger," handing her another glass of wine. Good Lord, had she already finished was it the 4th or 5th glass now? That was somewhat concerning. "Yes, I am correct," she said. "Thank you for noticing." Draco rolled his eyes, but she saw a small smile form as he drank from his glass. She looked at him for a moment. He didn't look as dazed as Hermione was sure she did, but he was leaning more comfortably on the couch as well. The heat of him was searing next to her, and when she blinked it was to find him looking at her, his grey eyes refracting off the brimming fireplace. His eyes were like silver fire. "You're definitely blushing," Draco said. "It's the wine," she said quickly. Draco raised his hand and palmed her cheek, warmth meeting fire. "Even redder," he said in a husky tone. He was definitely tipsy. Hermione didn't know what compelled her to do it. Maybe it was the warm light of the fire, but she thought he was looking at her with a desperate sort of adoration. She lifted her hand to his cheek and brought his face to hers. She kissed him soundly, and when he tensed, she braced herself for him pulling away, but all he did was give a ragged exhale before grabbing her wrist and pulling her closer. Every person should have this kind of kiss in their life, Hermione thought. He couldn't pinpoint if it was the technique he had employed, which was marvelous because it was nervous and somewhat sloppy as he tried to find the right angle of their lips, or if when they connected, they fit in an indescribably vulnerable way. But the sheer force of emotion welling up in her throat couldn't be defined by a single word. Draco gripped her waist, pulling Hermione flush against him, his other hand moving along the contours of her face, delving into her curls. She felt a wash in his touch, his hands somehow touching everywhere, but still not enough. She decided that the only way to rectify this was to wrap herself around him, to kiss him deeper, to contribute to her own devouring. He moved him until he was lying atop of her on the couch, chest to chest, as they kissed. Hermione squirmed under the weight of his body pressing down on her. His hands fluttered open to grasp as much of her as he could, and his hips pressed up against her stomach, teasing her most sensitive spot. He was touching her everywhere, his hands, his mouth, his stupid white blonde hair tickling her face as he laved at her neck, was doing things to Hermione that felt downright sinful. She was liable to become putty in his arms, and she didn't know how to reconcile that thought with the fact that it was Draco. And then all thoughts were lost altogether as he reached a hand around the back of her neck, tilting her head up as he sucked on the point between her collarbone and shoulder. "Ah, Draco!" She raised her hips to meet his and heard him groan against her. As he sucked deeper, drew their bodies closer, Hermione heard herself whimper, and then his sucking became a nip, and she moaned, and then... Hermione gasped as she felt Draco's fangs graze her neck. He stood above her, before violently throwing himself off of her. She lay there for a moment, breathing heavily as her pounding heart tried to calm down. She sat up and looked at Draco. He was ashen-faced, breathing through his palm as he covered his mouth. She lifted her hand and reached for him. "Draco?" He flinched away from her. I'm so sorry." He looked like he was going to be sick. "Draco, it's fine," Hermione tried. He looked sharply at her. "It's not fine. I almost didn't stop myself from biting you." Her cheeks heated. "It's okay, I was just surprised." He didn't seem to be listening. He was becoming progressively more horrified while he stood there. "Draco!" she said louder. He met her eyes. There was a silver sheen in them as he stared at her. "It's not like I didn't know you were a vampire before kissing you," she said. "Whether you can bite me did not factor in my decision. I trust you." His lips thinned. "Oh, really?" He stalked towards her, where she sat on the arm of the couch and put his hands on either side of her hips. "Why are you trembling then, Hermione?" he asked in a cool and seductive voice. Dark. His voice was dark, but she didn't know how to properly express that adjective. She only knew that the dark hole he was intrigued her. "I'm nervous, not scared. This is new territory for me." "Is this supposed to be?" He gestured between the two of them. "New territory?" She bit her lip and Draco retracted. "Do you want it to be?" A moment's hesitation. "No," he said against her mouth, his lip grazing hers as he spoke. She smiled. "Is that why you're so close?" He exhaled raggedly. "I don't have much control left, Granger," he said. His voice was pleading. She palmed his cheek. "You won't hurt me." His eyes widened, but before he could say anything else, she grabbed a hold of his shirt and pulled him down to her. She kissed and kissed him. She kept kissing him until her lungs were burning and she had to draw breath, and she realized that she had climbed on top of him at some point. He was supporting her with his hands on her bum. "How did I honestly have no idea," he replied. He set her down, which made Hermione feel a sense of loss, but then he wrapped his arms around her in a bear hug and crushed her to his chest. "This isn't a good idea," he said against her hair. She hugged him tighter so he wouldn't let go. "Who says?" His head dropped back and he groaned. "Ranger." She kissed him again. He didn't hesitate this time. To be continued. Thank you for listening to this chapter of 8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire by Simplified Emotions. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, You can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.